Well, welcome everybody to another segment of Lewis at Large. Yours truly, Warner Lewis, from the flight deck as always. And of course, that means some smart talk radio is in your future. And this segment should be an interesting one. We have not talked about this subject specifically. We have talked about marijuana. We've talked about the marijuana for-profit business. We've talked about medical marijuana in the past. But we have not talked about the marijuana industry as it's related to banking relationships and how is the marijuana industry handling their money. No better person to talk to about this than Marc Armstrong. He is currently the president of Commonomics USA, which just launched the Public Banking Policy Project to provide legal, policy, and economic information to advocates of public banking. We'll talk about that concept. And also in the past, he was a founding executive director of the Public Banking Institute. So it should be an interesting conversation indeed. Mark, how are you, my friend?
Hey, Warner, I'm great. How are you doing?
Well, we're good here. Let's do this. I certainly want to talk about the financial industry's relationship with the marijuana business as it stands today. But let's do our listeners a little bit of a favor. Tell us a little bit first about the Public Banking Institute. You were a founding executive director of that, and then also share with us a little bit about the mission of Commonomics.
Sure. So everybody remembers the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, and during that time period, there were a number of us out in Northern California who were talking about developing a greater awareness about the Public Bank of North Dakota. And the reason why we centered in on that particular bank is because it's a public bank. It's the only state-owned bank in the United States. And public banks are very common across the world, but in this country, we just don't have much knowledge about public banking. So we formed the Public Banking Institute, and what we did was primarily provide educational sessions and develop a lot of the material on public banking. And then a few years later, I went off and formed Commonomics USA because we wanted to focus on postal banking in addition. And postal banking, there's a postal banking coalition called the Campaign for Postal Banking, which was launched a couple years ago, and that's a coalition. And so we focus on, Commonomics focuses on postal banking as well as public banking, basic income, anything having to do with banking and money.
What
from a public policy perspective.
Sure. And again, give us a little bit more about your background. How did you get into this arena to begin with?
Well, I got into it. My job was with IBM Finance in San Francisco, and B of A and Wells Fargo were my accounts for quite a few years, and so I understood wholesale banking. And it just so happens that Bank of North Dakota is a wholesale bank. It's a banker's bank essentially, and so I was really interested in how to use that model to support community banks across the country. And the reason why I was interested is because if you look at the statistics, I mean, there are fewer and fewer community banks every year. They're closing up shop, and what we end up with is an 800 number in many communities to get a mortgage, to get whatever you need. And that's provided by primarily Wall Street banks, who also kind of crashed the economy in 2008. So we think a community bank sector is really important, and a public bank will support that.
Right. What I'm sure the private banking industry gets very, very nervous, and their eyes start to dart when you start to talk. But what are you finding? And again, there's also lobbying efforts too. But just in general, what's your sense of the sentiment up at Capitol Hill on something like that?
Well, the nice thing about public banks is that it's a decentralized solution. We don't need to depend upon congressmen or senators to foster this solution. It's a grassroots effort. It's done either at the municipal, county, or state level, and you don't need to ask permission by anybody in D.C. So that's what's ideal about it. We all know that there's a lot of gridlock in D.C., and this is something that people can develop and put in place at a local level in order to support, as I said, the community banks and locally owned businesses in their area. So North Dakota has proven that model, and so it's a good model to replicate.
Well, as we drift towards this relationship here between marijuana and money, marijuana is legal and sold in almost half the states in the country, and as well as the District of Columbia, either for recreation or medical use. And yet, precious few, probably count them on one hand, certainly two hands, those that have legitimate, so to speak, banking relationships, loan relationships, deposit relationships. Even those these are legally run businesses. I know the thought of marijuana money in banks makes bank regulators absolutely panic, but share with us from your perspective, is there a wire around about that? What are the pros of that, and what are the cons?
So let's talk about the issue first before we talk about a solution involving public banks. The issue that you touched on has to do with the fact that marijuana is a Schedule I drug. It is prohibited by the federal regulations, and because of that, any transaction involving marijuana is essentially drug money. Now, what I'm talking about is just recreational marijuana. So I'm not talking about medicinal marijuana, where there are a lot of exceptions that have been carved out for. So we're just talking about recreational marijuana right now. And recreational marijuana is state legal. There have been initiatives in 4 different states to approve the use as well as business involvement in recreational marijuana. So those states are Alaska, Washington, Oregon, and Colorado. There are another 8 states plus who have initiatives in place for this November, and those 8 states will more than likely approve recreational marijuana. So we're going to end up with 12 or 13 states that have essentially decreed by statute that recreational marijuana is legal, and yet it's still classified by the DEA as a Schedule I drug. And so because it's a Schedule I drug, it is going to, the money associated with it is prohibited. Well, it's not prohibited, but there are these SARs, these reports that have to be created by bankers on a monthly basis, reporting if they think they've taken in any drug money or right, if any of their clients are involved in it. And
right.
so
SARs being a suspicious activity report.
Yes, right. I'm sorry. And so because of that, there's this compliance burden on bankers, and it gets to be too onerous, and particularly since it involves a federal crime. You know, a lot of bankers just don't want to put their tellers on the front line of this battle and expose them to the risk of being arrested. So a lot of the banks have just shied away from accepting either cash or electronic transactions, and so you end up with this state legal industry, which is completely cash-based, and people are putting money under their mattresses or right, wherever they can hide it.
Right.
And you end up with an increase in the risk associated with doing business, legitimate business from the perspective of within these 4 states. And so it's problematic for both the businesses as well as for the bankers.
Mark, from your perspective, historically, have banks and any other state legal, if nothing else, state legal industry gone through anything like this? This feels like an awfully unique situation. I'm wondering if part of this is there's a lot of unfertile ground here.
Well, some people say that prohibition in the 20s was like this, but it actually was not. Because remember that there was a constitutional amendment, number 18, which prohibited the sale and distribution of and production of alcohol, and then that was repealed by another constitutional amendment. So that was at the federal level, but we don't. It was never approved at a state level for people to use. And in this situation, the U.S. Constitution does not prohibit the production and sale and use of marijuana. It is something that the DEA has decreed. And so it is federal law, of course, but the states have gone ahead and made it state legal in these 4 states. And so It's a very unique situation. I can't think of anything that's even closely similar to it.
Yeah. Again, if you just joined us, yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck of Lewis at Large Radio, and we're in the midst of an interesting segment with Marc Armstrong. Marc, he was many originally with IBM, but was the founding executive director of the Public Banking Institute, which was a network of city, county, and state-owned public banks sharing best practices. And now currently serves as president of Commonomics, which has just launched the Public Banking Policy Project to provide legal and economic information to advocates of public banking. Before we close out on this subject of marijuana and banking, do you see this as more and more as marijuana, medical or otherwise, becomes legal, so to speak, at the state level? Does that necessarily put more pressure on the feds to find some kind of a solution, or are they really pretty much oblivious and kind of looking the other way on the whole issue?
Well, it does put more pressure on them, and ideally, I think in a perfect world, we'd all want for Congress to enact some legislation. But there were a number of different proposals over the summer which did not get through Congress, and so I'm not. And given that we're in an election year, the two main presidential nominees have not indicated that they would support this. I think we're still going to be in the stalemate going forward, but time will tell. The proposal that I've made in the most recent article from a week ago is to essentially have public banks in these 4 states handle the transactions involving marijuana money. And, I think many of us are just really tired of government being in the regulation business. And if they can step out of it a little bit and provide a service in this area through a public bank, I think it would be welcome. It's certainly needed. And the way to do it is simply to have a public bank created by either the financial officers in a county or municipal level, or at the state treasurer at the state level. And it would be a bank on paper, and you end up accepting the cash through armored cars. It would pick up the cash on a regular basis. It would be electronically deposited into the accounts of these marijuana businesses, and the cash would be deposited at the most close Federal Reserve. And so you end up facilitating the acceptance of this cash and putting in place really good standards so that you're not taking in money which is prohibited from being taken in. The Department of Justice has issued a Cole memo, a memo which allows for certain transactions to occur, and a public bank can make sure that is enforced completely.
And it would all be above board, and everybody would see it, and the record keeping would be pretty clean. Interesting dichotomy that this issue raises for sure. Okay, let's talk Commonomics USA, which probably many of our listeners, if not all, probably are not familiar with us. Give us some background about that, and let's talk about also the Public Banking Policy Project in depth.
Sure. So the main premise behind Commonomics USA is to recognize that it is the commons that is the source of all of our wealth. So if you look at that glass of water on your desk, what's in it is water that comes from a watershed which we hold in common. It could be a national forest or a stream that's in public ownership. If you look at the Wi-Fi signal, those are radio signals that have been licensed by the government to private corporations. But it's those radio signals that we own in common. We can just go down the list of all these different industries where the basis of the wealth that's created is the commons that we hold in common. It's not money. We all like to think that, many of us think that money is the basis of wealth. And we want to point out that it's what we hold in common, which is actually a kind of radical idea, but what we hold in common ensures our wealth. And so we advocate for responsible development of that. And by the way, we think banking and public credit, which is what a public bank creates, is something we all hold in common, and that's why we advocate for a public option, being state-owned banks. And so that's what we advocate for. We choose banking and monetary-type issues to advocate for, typically distributed, although postal banking is centralized in D.C., but certainly public banks are something that is that can be done at a state or county level.
What kind of tell us a little bit about Commonomics in terms of, I mean, is it looking to add members, or is it a lobbying group, or tell us exactly? I mean, I know you're doing several things.
Yeah, what we're doing is we're providing education to a lot of other nonprofits. We do like the model of just working with nonprofits and providing education on different topics, complex topics regarding economic public policy. And we recognize, as do a lot of nonprofits who've been involved in social justice, they are now getting more and more involved in economic issues, and it is foreign territory to them. And so we provide policy papers and other information to them to help set their strategy. We make the claim that, unless you address banking and fundamental economic issues, you can never, a nonprofit can never be successful in achieving its goals. And the reason why is we say that is because banking is so central to our economy, and there are so few people who know much about it, especially how credit is created. We like to think that deposits are lent out, but they're not. The banks have the ability to create loans just by writing them in their books, and that goes for deposits as well when it's generated by a loan. And once you understand that, you recognize that we've given this incredible monopoly to private bankers, and a public bank is a public option which allows for old folks' homes to be funded, infrastructure to be funded at low rates. You can go down the list. If anybody is interested in this, they can go to the Bank of North Dakota website, just look at their annual report from last April, and there are all these projects that many of us think that we cannot fund in our own communities, that they are funding in North Dakota. And the reason why they're able to do that is because they have a public option when it comes to credit.
Mark, what about, and again, this is a little bit off topic, but I'm going to throw it out there just to examine it. The model of the branch bank, 3 or 4 on every corner. There's no secret that branch visits are going down. The way people bank is changing, technology-wise, and the way they think about their bank. How does that play in any way, shape, or form to the entire concept of a public bank?
Right. So a public bank, the model that Bank of North Dakota has is more of a wholesale bank. So because of that, it does not have a network of ATMs. It doesn't have a network of branches, et cetera. You could go down the list of services that it does not typically provide to the retail customer. And that's because it's in the business of generating loans for businesses, and it routes those loans through community banks. There are over 100 community banks in North Dakota that it partners with. And so, I think that you're right, that retail business for banks is going down, is diminishing. There are exceptions to that. I mean, the use of cash is much higher and unexpected than it used to be, depending upon the generation. But a public bank would probably be more like Bank of North Dakota. It does not need retail branches. The only exception to that would be a postal bank, where all of the 30,000 plus post offices throughout this country can provide financial services, money services to people, and much of that can be delivered through a mobile phone. But people would still need to go into a post office to cash a check or to conduct certain transactions that they can't do on their phone. The way to scale it, though, is, of course, with technology, and it makes the cost per transaction to be a lot less.
Well, I know you're working very hard to educate people on this concept of a sort of a public bank through shows like this and other interviews and other outreach that you're doing. What go out 5 years from now? Tell us how do you believe you will have done, and how will you know when you've done a good job?
Well, when Kansas opens its state bank, I think we will know we've done a good job.
We're going to be the bar, the success bar, huh? Okay.
Yeah, I like to set that bar pretty high. So
Yeah.
so yeah, but you know what? I think what we've all recognized is there are some there's this meme or belief system that's going around that says we're broke and that we can't afford certain things, and it's just crazy when you think 50, 60 plus years ago, when we were a lot poorer in a sense, we were able to fund major projects even during the 30s, like in California, the California Aqueduct, the San Francisco Bay Bridge. Those were all funded through credit, and once we realized that credit is something that can be used for the common good, it does not need to be used just to benefit Wall Street bankers, then we can recognize that we can start funding a lot of these things. The San Francisco Bay Bridge is a good example of a project that was funded. It only cost $85 million back in the 30s, and it cost a little bit more than that when you considered interest. Over the last 15 years, it's been rebuilt, and it was reopened about 2-3 years ago. The Bay Bridge retrofit and rebuilding cost over $6 billion, and it's going to be another $6 billion of interest just to pay for that. And that's because it was financed through private credit loans. And it's just, we don't need to do that. We could have, if we had a public bank in California that could have issued very low cost credit, which then retrofitted the Bay Bridge for much less than $6 billion of interest.
Well, it is a fascinating concept, that of public banks. Again, our guest has been Marc Armstrong. He was the founding executive director of the Public Banking Institute and now is president of Commonomics, which is working to provide legal policy and economic information to advocates of public banking. Marc, how can our listeners find out a little bit more about Commonomics and the concept of public banking? Where can they go?
Right. They can just go to commonomicsusa.org, or if you can't spell that, just go to publicbanking.org and you'll be redirected.
Well, we appreciate your insights on the banking industry, also how it relates to the marijuana industry, and best of luck to you, and we'd love to have you back on again sometime.
Thank you, Warner. Keep in touch.
You bet. We will be back with more right after this on Lewis at Large.